Okay everyone, so I'm going to record this video to show you the basic workflow that you'll need to complete your Project 2 in Bootstrap. One of the overarching issues I was seeing today during the workday is that we're not following the standard workflow on building rows and columns and putting our components inside of those columns. So I wanted to go back over the way to do that, so as you're building your pages over the next few days that you're doing it correctly. So remember that you should be working out of the Bootstrap template that I've provided you. You can get that from the resources page on our course site. So if you click the link, it will go ahead and download, it'll go ahead and download the Bootstrap starter, which you can then unzip, and you can take this whole folder into Atom. And that way you'll already have your folders set up in the correct order, with a CSS file inside of the CSS folder, and everything is in the correct order. Any images you need can just live inside of that folder, but you'll be able to find things correctly. So here we have the index page, and the index page is always your home page. So this will be what serves as your home page. You don't need to rename it to home.html or anything like that. And I already have this page set up the way it needs to be for Bootstrap to work correctly. All you have to do is come into this area here where I've written your content goes here, and this is where you'll start writing your rows and your columns, and then putting your content inside of that. So the standard workflow would be to look at the sketches that you've done for your site and figure out how many columns that would take. So let's say I wanted to have 3 cards spaced out evenly across the page. All of those cards will go into one row. So I'll write my div class row, and I'm going to go ahead and close that div, so that way I know I have a row built. And I can add a label saying that this closing div tag is closing a row. So now inside of this row is where my columns will go. If I want 3 cards to go across the page, I'll need 3 divs that each span 4 columns, because 4 times 3 is 12. So I'll do another div. In this class, I'll say column, the standard is MD for medium screens, and I'll do 4. So we know that this div is stretching 4 columns. I'll go ahead and close this div and label it that I'm closing a 4 width column. And I know I want to have 3 columns, so I'll just go ahead and copy this and paste it twice. So now I have my 3 columns of 4 inside of my row. So we have 1 row, and inside of that we have 3 columns, each that span 4 of the 12 columns that Bootstrap gives us. Now inside each of these columns is where your components will go. So don't start adding jumbotrons or carousels or cards or any of that stuff until you have a row with columns built out. If you have any of those components outside of rows or outside of columns, they're not going to be organized the way you want them to be. So now you can go to getbootstrap.com, and inside the documentation and components is where you'll find the things that you can use. So if I want a card, I'll go to the cards section, find the code for the cards, copy it, come back into Atom, and I'm going to paste it inside each of my columns. I'm going to clean up some of the tabbing and spacing to make sure I can see this cleanly. And if I want a card in every single column, I'll take the card code and paste it into every single column. So you have to make sure that you have your rows and your columns organized first, then you can start putting in your content. Now I don't have any images put in here, but you can see now that I have my 3 cards showing up in one row. This is how we get things to appear next to each other. So every time you want something to appear next to something, it has to be in a separate column, but inside the same row. If you want it to appear underneath it, you'll start a new row. So if I want to start a new row, I'll come down here to where I closed this last row, and I'll create a new row. So now everything that gets written inside of this row is going to appear underneath those cards I just created. Now just a little quick tip about cards. For some reason in Bootstrap 4, Bootstrap added this style attribute and value here. If you go ahead and take those off, your cards will become automatically responsive, which is the whole point of Bootstrap. So I suggest going ahead and doing that, and that way they'll always stretch the full width of the columns you've created, just like that. So we have this new row here. Let's say I want something that goes 6 columns of the 12. So for this div, I'll give it a class of call-md-6. So that's saying it'll take up 6 of the 12, or half of the page. Go ahead and close it. And now I can put whatever I want inside of that. Here I'm going to add 2 columns of 3. And I'll add another column of 3 on the top side of the 6. So here I have 3 and then 6 and then 3. So I have 2 small columns on the outside of something centered in the middle that's taking up the full width of the page. And you don't have to put any content in these columns if you're just going to center content. So let's say I'm going to put a slideshow that I want centered in the middle of the screen that stretches half the width. This is a way to do that. So I'll go back to getbootstrap.com. I'll grab, you could do a carousel. I'll do a Jumbotron just so we can see more content without me having to add the images. I'll come in and put that in my 6-span column here. Oops. And so this is in a separate row from those cards we just created up here. So this will appear underneath those cards. So as I refresh here, we now have a Jumbotron centered here in the middle. Now you can see there's some margin issues here, so we'll have to target the rows in our main.css and do some editing there, but otherwise we have this stuff laid out correctly. But that's the basic way of organizing your content and making sure everything will show up properly. So the first step is to write a row inside of the container, and then inside of that row you can add your columns. Each column is in its own div, and all of those columns come inside its own div class row, and all of the rows go inside div class container. So you should have div class container on there once that goes around all of your content. Then you'll have a few div class rows inside of the container, and then a few div class call-md- whatever inside each row. So you've laid out your home page and now you're ready to work on your next page. What I would suggest doing is you can either duplicate your index page. So let's say you're making an about page, you've duplicated it, You have all the same code. Now just grab everything you've put inside of the container. Oops, let's try this again. Grab everything you've put inside of the container and delete it, and you're back to that template that I sent you. And the way we link between these pages is the same as we did last time. So if you have a drop-down menu that has links in it, and they've given you an href with ... Here inside this href is where you would go index.html, just like we did in the last project. So hopefully that cleared up some of the problems I saw today during the workday. As usual, you can always DM me. If any questions you have, you can also use #questions to ask each other questions, and I'll also be around campus throughout the rest of the week with my office hours.